We've all set a score with this weird monument in it before. Often we're told that this is cbrushing or combo break rush. But what exactly does that mean? And what is nearest input, mash pores, and the boo window? And how does all of this tie together? Lots of different terminology will be discussed in this video, and it all has an effect on how accurate you have to be when it comes to hitting bigger chord patterns, so you might want to watch until the end. Nearest input is an input system that determines how your keystrokes are interpreted. The notes nearest to the input will be selected as a hit, regardless of what the player was intending to do, so long as that note is within the game's largest timing window. In this scenario, if I were to hit the key now, since this note is the closest to the receptor, it would be the one that the game decides to target. However, since there's a large time gap between the notes and the receptor, it isn't counted as a hit, as it's outside of the note's timing window. And most players can intuitively understand this. The problem comes when note density increases, and the player is attempting to perform outside of their comfort zone, causing their inputs to be disorderly. As the notes become more compact and close to the receptor, their timing windows will begin to overlap. In this case, if the player performs an early, stray input, it will trigger the nearest note, most likely causing a boo or a good judgment. The player not realizing their early hit, they'll want to press again for the nearest note that they see, but because of this game mechanic, that note is already classified as a hit. So this input will go to the next note in the sequence, but the input is happening earlier than intended, causing another boo or good judgment. This is cbrushing. The cycle can continue indefinitely if there's enough notes close together in the sequence, and the player would have to stop their inputs altogether for a sufficient amount of time to leave the pre-existing note windows, or vastly shift how fast or slow they're tapping. Now, if you've been paying attention, you can realize how this boo window is a main factor of how difficult a nearest input system can feel to play on, and increasing or decreasing this window dictates how much leeway you're given. In previous versions of Eterna, changing the judge difficulty would also change the boo window of that difficulty. So if we compare J4 to J7, having a max boo window of only 90 milliseconds compared to 180 decreases the chance of cbrushing occurring. Stray taps in between notes would be less likely to fall within the note's timing window and would be counted as a miss, or allow the player to recover by tapping again, without affecting the following note's judgment. J7 might have stricter windows, but since everything on Eterna Online is converted back to J4, playing on J7 on average gives the player an easier time. Take this a step further to J8 or Justice, and cbrushing would be even more unlikely to occur. Nowadays, the standard boo window for all judgments is locked to 180 milliseconds. This puts all users on an even playing field, but also allows for customization of timing windows. Here's my windows I played on for all of my 2022 scores. It's a sort of ×2 per each judgment kind of thing. Oh, a like button. Weird. Now, we've talked about ways of making nearest input easier, but what about making it harder? And why would anyone want to do that? SoundSphere has the option to enable nearest input handling, and you can also customize the max window of hits. Setting this to around 500 milliseconds or higher basically creates the effect of mash pores, which I'll explain a bit later. Any straight inputs where there's no notes on the screen will immediately be applied to the next nearest note. So when it does appear on the screen, it's already darkened out, meaning it's no longer active. Just trying to play a handstream chart normally, and you can see what I mean. Pretty much half the screen is dark. Obviously, this is an extreme version of this type of input system, so setting the maximum window to 200 or 180 milliseconds is recommended, as it seems to be around the norm for most games. I'm not sure to what extent SoundSphere handles this. For example, if I set the window to 20 seconds and then mash a lot, would that immediately cancel out half the notes in the chart? Or is there some sort of upper limit and say notes further in the chart haven't actually rendered in yet? This is all meaningless to discuss because playing with the number so high is just flat out unenjoyable. There's this video from years ago that I can no longer find, but it was basically this guy just mashing through a 7-key map with one hand, I think, and hitting everything. The comments were saying how Osumania is not a good game and that BMS is better or whatever. In Beatmania terminology, an excessive pour or mash pour is a judgment awarded to the player when you tap keys outside of the note's timing window, essentially mashing. Osu doesn't have nearest input or a mash pour system, but there is a point to where the boo window does come into play, and most players will quickly realize that trying to mash through a 3 or 4 star map will result in failing. There's only 2 ranked maps I know of where this mechanic breaks entirely: Materialize Anything and Pumping Iron, both on halftime, both requiring no mania skills and just an ounce of careful timing. Players can full mash their way to a 300 or 400 pp without any prior mania experience. Now, the fact that this only happens to 2 of the 14,000 ranked difficulties there are is pretty amazing, and I think this speaks more about these 2 specific maps being ranked rather than the game's input system as a whole. But I know that the ranking criteria doesn't exactly take into account what happens when mods are applied, or something like that. But either way, apparently laser has the nearest input, so maybe mashing in that client is less likely to be successful, but that's something I'm not willing to explore as of now. There's one last point about mashing I'd like to bring up. You've seen me play 10 key many times on this channel before, in videos and streams, but if you look closely, I'm not actually hitting the patterns accurately. I'm jump drilling with both hands and doing staircases with all fingers, even though there's only 3 notes on the screen, and everything else in between. When I first started 10 key, I was more worried about this, and I wanted to be more accurate when it came to finger usage. But the more I play, I realized that mashing is sort of a pseudo skill by itself. Players will gradually learn when patterns are okay to be played incorrectly and inaccurate, and also when it's important to hit things exactly as they are. If there are no notes in a column for a stretch of a map, then it doesn't matter if I accidentally tap through or not, as it doesn't affect my score. And in most cases, it might be even better or safe to overtap, just to keep my hands more steady or to not lift the wrong finger. But this starts to become subjective, and objectively, the best case would be to play the pattern 100% accurately 100% of the time, and just have that skill. Just hit the notes, bro. Basically, I'm saying that for most cases, these little ghost taps are okay and not problematic. Except when they are problematic. There's an obvious breakpoint to when you can and cannot mash in a given pattern, and failing to learn the proper technique can lead to players hitting skill walls seemingly out of nowhere. The biggest example of this is 10 key Dawn 4 to Dawn 5. In fact, if you recently cleared the 4th Dawn, you're more than likely to fail on the very first song of the 5th, as all the previous patterns you're required to learn don't exactly require this level of chord precision. Even on my replay, you can see I'm making a bunch of input mistakes. Going forward, the Dawn levels require more and more levels of chord precision, so always ghost tapping and mashing when there's no notes can lead to some poor habits forming, and eventually, you'll have to learn to play accurate anyway. But as long as you're mentally trying to hit the notes as accurately as you can, then there's no reason to stress over this. This goes back to sound sphere nearest input and cranking up the hit window. Playing like this is probably not necessary for practice, but maybe a mechanic could be implemented in a way that punishes this set of notes and not these. So when the actual stray tap occurred, I mean there's also the boo window for the next note, but still the mistake is happening exactly when you tapped. There is a spam counter, but this has no bearing on the score, and the current way it's implemented is not a good idea either. So to summarize, nearest input is a mechanic that sets your inputs to the nearest note to the receptor, so long as it's within the timing window. The boo window is locked at 180 milliseconds for all judge difficulties in the latest versions of Eterna. The combination of the two can create cbrushing, where your intended inputs are being classified differently to the game. Players can develop the feel of when extra taps may or may not be acceptable, but ultimately, playing the patterns accurately as possible is recommended. Knowing all of this, it can explain why Eterna may feel more difficult than other games, but 10 key and Eterna especially feels completely off to me, so stay tuned for a potential video on that. Feel free to subscribe, comment if you have any tips on how players can improve at bigger chord patterns, and thanks for checking out this video. Meaningless to discuss though, this is all meaningless to discuss, because